Oh, hello. I do believe that we are live, which leaves me to say hello and welcome to another fun filled edition of Adam's Music Box. Today is, in fact, the Saturday live streaming edition. So, over the last couple of weeks, both on these extended streams and on the short videos I do during the week, I've been talking about regional tastes and regional aspects of music because, after all, folk music, which is the basis of all pop music, began as something that was one unprofessional in the literal sense, meaning people were playing for fun. They weren't playing as a vocation, as a job. And the other thing that folk music entailed is that things were very much localized, and at most they were regionalized. A local sound was based on the cultural, historical, traditional characteristics of that locality and an oral sonic tradition that was passed down from one generation to another of amateur musicians who played and sung in that specific locality. And over time, characteristics of localities became characteristics of regions, and folk music had a very distinct regional flavor. You could hear something from any particular region in the world, and it would be identifiable to those who could recognize it. In classical music or art music, as it was referred to before the term classical became in vogue, things were remarkably similar. It was dissimilar in the sense that you had highly literate professional musicians playing the music as a profession, either early on for a church or for an aristocratic court. Later on in the 19th century, when classical music became democratized and pop and something for the populace, it became something sustained through things like ticket sales and publishing sales and various organizations that were supported by groups of individuals and sometimes even by a city or state. Now, it was still something that had a regional character. Every great orchestra in the 19th and well into the 20th century had unique national characteristics. Dutch orchestras sounded one way. Within even Germany and the wider Germanic realms, Vienna, Austria, Berlin, Germany, Frankfurt, all these different cities, Dusseldorf, all of them had unique orchestral sounds. And even within a country where a lot of the musicians were a combination of locally grown musicians and European imports, I'm talking about the United States, the big five orchestras of the US each had their own unique flavor. Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Chicago, and Boston, the big five American orchestras, all at that time in the late 19th into the sort of mid-ish 20th century, they all sounded quite unique. And so the disappearance of regional and localized sounds is something that's very interesting. And like I said on a previous stream, just to recap it, some people blame it on technology. Once we get to hear other things, somehow we process all of the various stimuli, whether it's from folk music from southern France or orchestral music from Berlin, or all of these different influences that we're able to access because of records and radio and later the internet and television sometime before that, that it all sort of becomes homogenized. There might be some truth to it, but even well into the age of mass media and recorded sound, there were still distinct sounds that came out of certain cities, certain regions, and certainly out of certain countries. I think it is instead more of a conscious decision by the socioeconomic elites to homogenize everything about our lives, to acculturate us, so that the way that people think, the way that people view tradition, the way that people view history, the way that people view their own lives is the same in Tallahassee as in Timbuktu, the same in Berlin as in Mexico City. And what we really have is sort of one global government all under an acculturated regime. And yes, many people are sort of fighting back against it in some countries and regions more than others. But I think that the homogenization we are seeing in the arts is very much related to socioeconomic trends among the ruling class rather than more slow, gradual, organic trends to do with the fact that prior to the age of mass communication, if you wanted to hear music, you needed to be in the single you needed to share a geographical space with a musician. And then things like player pianos, recorded sound, radio, and all of the other stuff that followed on from there made it so that you don't even need to be in the same street as a musician to hear music, because you could be in Beijing listening to the Vienna Philharmonic, you could be in Vienna listening to a Nigerian percussionist. And that I don't think has deteriorated unique characteristics. I think that aspect of democratization of music has generally been a very good thing. I think, again, it's the socioeconomic and socio-political trends that have made things so unfortunately homogenized. And that's sort of my summary of what I already talked about. But today I'm going to revisit something looking specifically at a genre, and not so much the people who make the music, but in this case, the people who consume the music, because these trends about regional and local and even national characteristics in music production, meaning the creation of music, the composition, the performance, it also applies to the consumption of music, which is just sort of a 20-buck word for the listening of music, or the listening to music, even. Water break. So, this is a genre that I examined a few weeks ago, I think, on this channel, and I think that it serves an important illustrative purpose for this as well, and it's prog rock. Now, prog rock is interesting in this experiment, in this analysis, because it's a genre that's almost been universally hated by the so-called critics from its inception right up to its various revivals, and even now as it enjoys its status as a kind of legacy genre. I know there are young people playing it and composing it, and that's great. But in terms of what the masses think of as prog rock, at this point, they think of it as a legacy genre. And that's okay, because that makes it useful for this line of analysis. So, one of the people who sort of unwittingly became one of prog rock's greatest drummers, Bill Bruford, always thought of himself as a jazz drummer, but he played in some very big prog rock bands for quite a long time. And he, in his book that came out in, I think, 2007, his autobiography, he made a very interesting comment about where prog rock was popular. And he noticed that it was very popular in the most ethnically white areas of what was, even then, this was post Hart Celler, post 65, even then, a changing in terms of demography, a demographically changing United States. And so he noticed that while prog rock was popular throughout North America, it was mainly in Midwestern cities that the genre was absolutely huge. And I found that very, very interesting on many levels. So let's look at what was going on demographically in the United States in the 70s. Well, the big East Coast cities were becoming more ethnically diverse than ever before, mainly as a product of the Hart-Celler Act, which was felt first and foremost in cities like New York, but also cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and to an extent Baltimore, the big sort of northeastern cities. And what this did is it created a lot of different appetites for different kinds of music. And overall, you could say that the mainstream East Coast audiences were very much pop music oriented. And perhaps that's because when you have a lot of competing ethnic musical tastes and productions, you sort of, when you're still white majority, which at the end of the day, the surrounding areas still were, you settle on something that's a musical compromise. And that was pop music. Now, what was going on in the South? Well, the South at that time was least affected by the Hart-Celler Act. And as the Great Migration continued to take, not all by any means, but a significant number of the Black population somewhere in the North, the South remained relatively demographically stable. And what's more is that of all of the regions of the US, the South probably had, and maybe you could argue still has, the most unique regional style. And maybe one of the reasons we say this is that music produced in the South or by Southerners has had a disproportionate influence, not just on Americana and American music, but on global pop music, which which of course has always, since its late 19th century inception, been an area where America leads, which is, if you want to talk about classical music in the 19th and early 20th century, Germany leads that. If you're talking about classical European in the centuries before, you could argue Italy, or a disunited group of states in mainly the northern and central parts of Italy lead that. Pop music has always been led by America, hence why we can look at the various regions of the US and see which ones have the greatest proportion of influence over the sounds of pop music. So that was the South. So we've done the East, the Northeast in particular, in the 70s, and we've done the South. Now, the West Coast has always had very unique characteristics because a nation founded by pioneers and settlers was always going to reach the opposite end of where it all began later on. And unique West Coast styles were always there, but because they were so subtle in many cases, they weren't necessarily as distinct as, let's say, the traditional pop sounds of New York, the traditional jazz sounds, never a pop genre, but certainly something that came of maturity in New York despite its southern roots. And so that leaves the Midwest. So to recap, the southern style, very pronounced, very influential. Northeastern style, pop vocal in particular always excelled in an area where many competing ethnic backgrounds, even before 1965, but much more so post 65, were looking for something that everyone could agree on. And again, this will happen on an unconscious level, but nevertheless one that is observable and detectable. And West Coast, something that had its own unique sound, but in a much more subtle way. So, what does that leave? That leaves the Midwest, an area that has always been the most, in terms of manufacturing and in terms of political influence, the most important in modern American history. And in terms of music, it is very interesting as well, because the Midwest has always been the cradle of rock, not just in terms of producing bands, because rock bands were produced everywhere, though you could argue disproportionately from the Midwest. You could push back on that too. But in terms of the consumption, no one could argue that the Midwest is rock's cradle in terms of consumers. And Bill Bruford, when talking specifically about progressive rock in his book, made a very interesting point. He noticed that when they were traveling to states like Michigan and Illinois and Iowa and Wisconsin, Indiana, Ohio, even further south to places like Kansas and Missouri, that bands in this prog genre were incredibly popular. However popular they might have been in Italy, which was very, and however popular they would have been in North America as a whole, which was very, the Midwest was a unique place in terms of just huge concert ticket sales, record sales, radio requests, which obviously lead to record sales. And in his 2007 autobiography, Bill Bruford tries to speculate on why this is. And when looking at the Midwest is an area that was very much not yet demographically touched by hard seller the way that the major northeastern cities were almost straight away. And probably second, you had your major southwestern cities touched by it. The South, because of its unique conditions, remained somewhat more immune to that particular act. But the Midwest slowly was sensing that things were changing. And by the 1970s, rock music, and particularly prog rock, said something very interesting to these audiences from the Midwest. Now, the majority of the white population by the 20th century in the Midwest were people that were mainly from West Central Europe. There was a lot of German stock, a lot of Dutch stock, some Nordic stock as well. And this can be contrasted with the super original founding stock of the United United States, which was mainly Anglo-Saxon or Scottish, some French, particularly French Protestant. But this was somewhat different. It was from a different part of Europe, sort of West Central as opposed to West West. And those countries that the majority of the white American population in the Midwest derived from were always disproportionately musical. These were places like Germany, like Holland, like Hungary, like Poland, like Austria, where there were very rich classical traditions, and where the argument could be made that folkish traditions and classical traditions were even closer to each other than they were in other parts of Europe. And so there was that aspect of things as well. This isn't what Bill Bruford said. This is me. I'll get to what Bruford said in a minute. What Bruford noticed is that in an America that post Hart Celler was changing, he didn't reference Hart Celler, he referenced the change, but that is why things were. That is why things were changing. That these white audiences who are from the backgrounds that I explained, not exclusively but largely, they were yearning for something that reminded them of home, reminded them of maybe even the home they never saw, but which nevertheless in a pre ultra homogenized world lived within them. It was something that was passed on from parents, grandparents, great grandparents, etc. Prog rock was a genre that fulfilled two important things for this demographic. This is sort of me and Bruford talking over each other, by the way. It was something that was very much European in the sense that it took a lot of themes from European classical music and from very distinct forms of European folk music, and it packaged them into an art form that derived from pop music and then became its own subgenre, rock and roll, that was quintessentially American. Now, American rock and roll obviously has its roots in the black music of the South, and secondly, the black music of the North, and thirdly, from the white music of multiple parts of America that then synthesized this and gradually turned soul and R&B into a distinct rock genre, which increasingly drifted away from the soul R&B, blues and gospel roots that underpinned it. So much so that by the 70s, rock and roll was a genre that was almost exclusively white, in the same way that soul, funk, and R&B were exclusively black. And then you had things like jazz fusion in the middle, which were really sort of 50-50. And when you look at the sort of ethnic compositions of bands like Return to Forever, Mahavishnu Orchestra, and Weather Report, you really see how at a time when radio itself was sort of dividing itself between white audience and black audience aimed stations, the jazz guys were more integrated racially than they would ever be before or since in many ways. And that's sort of an interesting aside. So these prog rock audiences in a country that was changing without them being asked, and changing in ways beyond both the literal and metaphorical representations of black and white, because America from its inception recognizably black parts, recognizably white majority parts, but post Hart Celler, this whole thing began to change. And the prog rock audiences, so said Bruford, and I tend to agree for the reasons that I've brought into this, they gravitated toward that. It was something that made them feel like they were experiencing something from home. And I think that that is a very interesting explanation for why the Midwest has always been a cradle of sort of traditional rock. So once rock sort of emerged from its roots in the late 50s and became a standalone genre, the Midwest has been huge. I mean, Sammy Hagar, where is he biggest? Biggest in St. Louis. And the one exception to this rule is probably Philadelphia, but Pennsylvania itself is a state that sort of straddles both culturally and physically the Northeast and the Midwest. And when you have the Enormo Dome and Veterans Stadium in a city, you can bet the people from Western Pennsylvania are going to travel to Philadelphia to see bands like Yes and bands like ELP. So even that sort of fits into this general discussion. Just seeing one of the live comments here. Sorry, joining late to this live, but in Kentucky. But is Kentucky part of the Midwest? I Kentucky is, I would consider Kentucky culturally South, but it's in sort of a region where it can definitely be touched by the Midwestern influence. And the user is from Turkey, but has a question about American music. Very interesting stuff indeed. And so what happened then to rock and roll? Well, what happened to the Midwest? The Midwest, until very recently, when it started, according to the latest demographic data, to sort of revive itself, it was an era that in the last couple of decades in the 20th century, it started losing its economic center and it started losing much of its population as a result. Deindustrialization of that part of the US, which was obviously one of the biggest mistakes ever made, even from a socioeconomic point of view. Culturally, it had this impact too. And what it meant is that the young people that were the cradle of rock's international foundations, welcome to the world of rock. Thank the Midwest for being the lodestone carrying this genre, which at least at one time was globally popular. As the Midwest lost its uh, confidence, its economy, and in some places its population, you see that rock and roll gradually started to decline. Because while, yes, it was popular everywhere, in other regions, it was never really something that had no competition. The South, huge competition from country and Western style music. In the Northeast, huge competition from singer songwriter and classic pop style vocalists. Classic pop being the people like Sinatra, Andy Williams, Vic Damone, and then the singer songwriters, the folks that came out of the 60s and 70s. In the West, you always had competition from, versions of rock or versions of jazz or versions of pop that were traditionally West Coast. So Toto, West Coast style rock. People like Billy Higgins, one of the great drummers of West Coast style jazz. You have West Coast style folk music. You have the San Francisco scene. Again, all of it somewhat derived from the music of elsewhere, but with that typical West Coast stamp. But with the Midwest, it was just rock was rock. The Midwest, whether it was hard rock, traditional rock, prog rock, which is something that Bill Bruford noticed particularly, it was really based in the Midwest. And the reason for it is because the Midwest was a region with particular demographic characteristics, and it was one that in many ways was most noticeably transformed by what happened post Hart Cellar, post 1965. Even though the Midwest isn't as diverse as the Northeast, for instance, it was felt more acutely because the East Coast, being ports of call, have always had a lot of interactions with other types of people that was always somewhat less pronounced, I would say a lot less pronounced in the Midwest. And so a lot of people have theories on why rock has sort of gone down in terms of popularity. John Cougar Mellencamp, or I think we're supposed to call him Mellencamp now, from a part of the Midwest, interestingly, had a theory that he explored on Joe Rogan the other week. But one interesting thing today to see is that Chad Casson, whose company is in Kansas, which is an extended part of the Midwest, he said something very interesting in an interview lately. He said that he's usually pretty good at predicting which records in his audiophile series of reissues are going to sell the best. But he said one thing that did surprise him was how popular Genesis is. Whenever he releases a Genesis audiophile remaster, it sells hugely. And now, why is that? He wasn't sure. I think this could be the reason that people longing for an America that was emblematic of a prosperous Midwest, people whose cultural values, their traditions, their family histories were shaped by that unique Midwestern culture, which still very much exists, albeit in somewhat less of a bulwark than it did sort of before the 1980s and the 1990s. It's people sort of reaching out for that and saying that, look, this is music that it speaks to a European heritage, but unlike modern Europe, which has totally lost its confidence, it combines the European heritage with a kind of confidence that in the so-called Western world, you still can find in America where you cannot really find it in Europe. You can find it in China, you can find it in India, but in the Western world, you can really only find it in America. And that's what prog rock really is: European traditions, modern musical confidence, the confidence to be virtuosic and be innovative, one eye to the future, all of these modern musical instruments, one eye to the past. And I think that if Chad is looking for an answer to that question of why those albums sell even higher than expectations, then I think that could be why. Another comment here, also as the recording technology, this is me reading the comment. Also, as the recording technology developed with effects and different recording techniques, musicians tend to move away from real sounding records to more experimental. Yeah, and that's actually something I've talked about in other streams about how the great technological advancements of instruments really opened up the door to exploration. Whether that makes things less regionally specific is a very interesting question. Because, of course, globally, there are instruments that to this day are associated more strongly with one region or another. There are certain instruments found, let's say, in Anatolia that you don't really see elsewhere, certain instruments found in southern India, etc. And maybe the sort of fact that a lot of the electronic instruments of the 20th century that were produced in one or two places and sold globally, maybe that had an effect on what we were talking about earlier as well. It really could be. No, all good. Just great comments there. We're wrapping up, I think, anyway, on this stream. But yeah, getting back to the prog thing, I think that is really that's the root of it. And when you're looking for why rock might have declined, well, has the Midwest lost its identity? Yes or no? Insofar as it's a less confident identity than it was prior to the stupid policy of deindustrialization, that could be one of the reasons. But maybe the fact that the Midwest might be slowly, at least in parts, coming back. Look at the record sales. Look what people are buying. They're buying that music that, while popular in many places in North America and globally, it was a music that first and foremost needed those Midwestern audiences. Very interesting thing to keep monitoring. As always, thanks for tuning in. Like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.